I need you to imagine being a young woman in rural Mexico in the 1950s. You're poor, uneducated, desperate for work to feed your family. Then you meet a well-dressed woman who offers you a job in the city. Good pay, respectable work, a chance to escape poverty. You accept immediately, grateful for this miraculous opportunity. You travel with her to Guanajuato, to a large house that looks prosperous and clean. Other women are there, and they seem nervous, but you ignore the warning signs because you need this job so badly. The well-dressed woman smiles at you and leads you inside. The door closes behind you, the lock clicks, and you realize, too late, that you haven't been hired. You've been purchased. You're never leaving this house alive. This isn't fiction. This is the true story of the Gonzalez sisters Delfina, Maria de Jesus, Maria Luisa, and Carmen Non, in Mexico as Las Poquianchis, who murdered at least 91 people in one of the most brutal crime sprees in Latin American history. Between roughly 1945 and 1964, the Gonzalez sisters operated a network of brothels across central Mexico. On the surface, they appeared to be successful businesswomen running legitimate establishments. But behind closed doors, these brothels were torture chambers and death camps where dozens of women and men were enslaved, brutalized, and murdered. The sisters recruited poor women from rural areas with promises of legitimate employment, then forced them into prostitution through violence, starvation, and psychological torture. Women who became pregnant, sick, or too old to be profitable were killed and buried on the properties. Male clients who appeared wealthy were sometimes murdered and robbed. Babies born in the brothels were killed or sold. The scale of violence was staggering, and it continued for nearly 2 decades before being discovered by accident when police responded to what they thought was a minor complaint about a missing person. What makes this case particularly disturbing is that it was organized and executed by sisters, by women, by people who society typically doesn't associate with serial murder or organized violence. The Gonzalez sisters weren't acting under male control or coercion. They built this empire of exploitation and death themselves, recruiting victims, training enforcers, managing operations across multiple locations, and personally participating in torture and murder. Delfina, the eldest, was the mastermind and primary sadist. Maria de Jesus helped manage the businesses. Maria Luisa handled recruitment. Carmen, the youngest, was less involved but still complicit. Together, they created a criminal enterprise that destroyed hundreds of lives and shocked Mexico when the full scope of their crimes was finally revealed. I've researched dozens of cases involving female killers, from Eileen Wuornos to the Papin sisters to countless others. But Las Poquianchis stand apart because of the duration, the scale, and the systematic nature of their crimes. This wasn't a crime of passion or a single violent outburst. This was organized crime, human trafficking, torture, and serial murder conducted as a business model over nearly 20 years. The sisters ran their operation like a corporation, with different locations, division of labor, and profit maximization strategies that happened to involve enslaving and murdering human beings. The banality of their evil, the way they treated murder as simply another business decision, is almost more disturbing than the violence itself. This is the story of Las Poquianchis, how 4 sisters from a troubled background became some of Mexico's most prolific serial killers, how they operated their empire of horror for 2 decades without detection, how their crimes were finally discovered, and what happened when Mexican society had to confront the reality that women could be just as monstrous as any male killer in history. I'm going to walk you through the sisters' early lives, the development of their criminal enterprise, the methods they used to control and kill their victims, the discovery that exposed everything, and the trial that revealed details so horrific that even hardened investigators struggled to process them. Because Las Poquianchis didn't just kill people. They proved that evil has no gender, that family bonds can be forged in blood and cruelty, and that the most dangerous predators are often the ones who hide behind social assumptions about what killers look like. The Gonzalez sisters were born into poverty and dysfunction in rural Guanajuato, Mexico, during the early decades of the 20th century. Their exact birth years are disputed in various accounts, but Delfina, the eldest, was born around 1912, followed by Maria de Jesus, Maria Luisa, and Carmen over the next several years. Their father, Isidro Torres, was an abusive alcoholic who terrorized the family. Their mother, Bernarda Gonzalez, was unable or unwilling to protect her daughters from their father's violence. The girls grew up witnessing and experiencing brutality as a normal part of daily life, learning early that violence was how you controlled others and got what you wanted. This background doesn't excuse what they later became, but it provides context for how 4 girls from a small Mexican village transformed into serial killers who would eventually be responsible for at least 91 confirmed deaths. The family dynamics were poisonous from the beginning. Isidro Torres sexually abused his daughters, a crime that was rarely discussed or prosecuted in rural Mexico during this period. The abuse created a twisted bond between the sisters. They were united by shared trauma, but that unity was built on violence and violation rather than love or support. Delfina, as the eldest, absorbed the most abuse and developed into a cold, calculating person who saw other humans as objects to be used and discarded. She would later replicate her father's abuse patterns on a massive scale, becoming the primary torturer and killer in the sisters' criminal operation. The younger sisters fell under Delfina's control, either through genuine loyalty, fear, or some combination of both. By the time they reached adulthood, the Gonzalez sisters had developed a worldview where exploitation and violence were normal, where other people's suffering meant nothing, and where family loyalty trumped any moral consideration. The sisters entered sex work in their late teens or early 20s, initially working in brothels owned by others. This was during the 1930s, when prostitution in Mexico existed in a gray legal area, technically illegal but widely tolerated and often controlled by organized crime or corrupt officials. Working in brothels, the sisters learned the business from the inside. They saw how madams controlled their workers through debt, violence, and isolation. They observed how clients could be manipulated and robbed. They recognized that sex work generated substantial cash flow, and that the women doing the actual work received almost none of the profits, while bearing all the risks and abuse. Most importantly, they learned that society viewed prostitutes as disposable, that violence against sex workers was rarely investigated or punished, and that women in this profession could disappear without anyone caring or asking questions. These lessons would form the foundation of their future criminal enterprise. By the mid-1940s, the sisters had saved enough money and made enough connections to open their own establishment. They chose Guanajuato, a city in central Mexico, with enough population to support their business, but not so large that they'd face overwhelming competition. Their first brothel was modest, just a house converted to accommodate several women and receive clients. But from the beginning, the sisters operated differently from typical brothel owners. They didn't hire women who were already in sex work and understood the profession. Instead, they targeted vulnerable women from rural areas, poor, uneducated, desperate for any opportunity to improve their circumstances. The sisters would travel to small villages, dress well and playing the role of successful businesswomen, and offer young women jobs in the city. The jobs were described as domestic work, cleaning, cooking, serving in restaurants or shops. The pay was described as generous. The opportunity was presented as life-changing, and desperate women, seeing no other options, would accept. The recruitment process was predatory in its design. The sisters specifically targeted women who were isolated and vulnerable, those without strong family connections, those fleeing abusive situations, those so poor that any promise of income seemed like salvation. They looked for women who wouldn't be missed if they disappeared, who had no one with the resources or knowledge to search for them. Once recruited, the women would be transported to the brothel in Guanajuato. During the journey, the sisters would be friendly and encouraging, maintaining the fiction that legitimate employment awaited. But once the women arrived at the house and were brought inside, everything changed. The doors were locked, the windows were barred, the women's identification papers and any personal possessions were confiscated, and then the sisters would explain the reality of their situation. They now owed money for transportation, housing, and food. They would be working in the brothel as prostitutes until that debt was paid off. Refusal meant violence. Escape attempts meant torture and murder. The sisters had created a perfect trap. The women they recruited were far from home, in an unfamiliar city, with no money, no identification, and no knowledge of how to navigate urban Mexico. Many were illiterate and had never been more than a few miles from their home villages. They didn't know who to trust or where to go for help. Even if they managed to escape the building, they had no resources to return home and no way to contact their families. The sisters exploited every vulnerability these women had, using their poverty, isolation, and lack of education as weapons to keep them enslaved. And because Mexican society in the 1940s and 50s viewed prostitutes with contempt and assumed they'd chosen that life willingly, any woman who did manage to escape and report what was happening would likely be dismissed or blamed rather than helped. The sisters understood these social dynamics perfectly and built their operation around them. Once trapped in the brothel, the women faced conditions that can only be described as slavery. They were forced to service clients constantly, with all money going directly to the sisters. They were given minimal food, just enough to keep them alive and working. They slept in cramped, filthy conditions, with multiple women sharing small rooms. They were not allowed to leave the building under any circumstances. They were beaten regularly to maintain control and create an atmosphere of fear. The sisters employed enforcers, men who were paid to guard the women, prevent escapes, and inflict violence when ordered. These men were chosen for their willingness to brutalize women without question or remorse. The entire operation was designed to break the women psychologically, to destroy any hope of escape or rescue, to reduce them to complete obedience through terror and deprivation. Delfina Gonzalez, the eldest sister, was the primary architect of this system and its most enthusiastic enforcer. Multiple survivor accounts and testimony from employees described Delfina as sadistic, someone who genuinely enjoyed inflicting pain and humiliation on the women under her control. She would beat women with her fists, whips, and clubs for minor infractions, or sometimes for no reason at all except her own entertainment. She forced women to fight each other for food or privileges, creating competitions where the winners received slightly less abuse and the losers faced escalated torture. She used starvation as punishment, locking women in basement cells without food or water for days. She conducted inspections where she would examine the women's bodies for signs of disease or pregnancy, and these inspections were deliberately humiliating and painful. Delfina wasn't just running a criminal enterprise. She was satisfying her own psychological need to dominate and hurt others, and her position as madam gave her unlimited victims and complete impunity. The fate of women who became pregnant, sick, or otherwise unable to work was uniformly tragic. The sisters viewed pregnancy as a business problem. A pregnant woman couldn't service clients, represented a loss of income, and created complications if anyone started asking questions about babies being born in brothels. So pregnant women were either forced to undergo dangerous illegal abortions or, if the pregnancy was too advanced, were allowed to give birth and then killed shortly afterward. The babies born in the brothels faced two possible fates. They were either killed immediately, usually by suffocation or simply being left to die from exposure and neglect, or they were sold to people seeking to adopt children through the black market. The sisters had connections to adoption rings and would sell healthy babies for significant sums, adding another profit stream to their operation. The number of babies killed or sold over the 2 decades the sisters operated is unknown, but likely numbers in the dozens. Women who became too sick to work faced a similarly grim outcome. The sisters provided no medical care, viewing sick women as worthless assets that were costing money through food and housing while generating no income. Women with sexually transmitted infections, injuries from client violence, or illnesses from the horrible living conditions would be isolated from the other women and simply left to die from neglect. Those who didn't die quickly enough would be actively killed, suffocated with pillows, strangled, beaten to death, or poisoned with cleaning chemicals. The sisters showed no mercy or compassion, even to women who had worked for them for years and generated substantial profits. Once a woman could no longer service clients, she became disposable, and the sisters disposed of her with the same casual indifference they might show when throwing away spoiled food. The method of body disposal was crude but effective given the time and place. The brothel properties had basements, courtyards, and gardens where bodies could be buried quickly. The sisters would have their male enforcers dig shallow graves and dump the corpses, sometimes multiple bodies in a single grave to save time and effort. They poured lime over the bodies to accelerate decomposition and reduce smell. They planted gardens and flowers over the graves to camouflage the disturbed earth and to serve as a grotesque form of landscaping. Over the years, the brothel properties became mass graves, with dozens of bodies buried beneath buildings where living women were being raped and tortured. The proximity of death to ongoing crimes created an atmosphere of horror that survivors later described as feeling like living in hell, where the smell of death mixed with the sounds of suffering, and where every woman knew that her ultimate fate was likely burial in that same soil. But the sisters didn't limit their victims. to the women they enslaved. They also murdered clients specifically, clients who appeared wealthy and who came to the brothel alone without anyone knowing their location. The sisters would identify these targets, usually through observation and conversation, that revealed the man carried significant cash or valuables. Then they would arrange for the man to be isolated with one or more women in a private room. Once alone, the man would be drugged, usually through alcohol mixed with sedatives. In his drugged state, he would be robbed of his money, jewelry, and any other valuables. Then he would be killed, usually through suffocation or strangulation, to avoid blood and noise. His body would be buried on the property alongside the murdered women. This expansion from murdering only their enslaved workers to also killing clients showed the sisters' increasing confidence and their complete lack of fear regarding consequences. They had been operating for years without detection, and they felt invulnerable. The sisters expanded their operations significantly during the 1950s. They opened additional brothels in other cities across Guanajuato state and potentially in neighboring regions. Each location followed the same model: recruit vulnerable women through deception, enslave them through debt, bondage, and violence, work them until they were no longer profitable, then kill them and bury their bodies on site. The sisters moved between locations, supervising operations and personally participating in violence and murder. They maintained control through fear and through carefully selected employees who were either too corrupt or too terrified to report what they witnessed. The operation generated substantial income, and the sisters lived well, buying property, wearing expensive clothes, and presenting themselves publicly as successful businesswomen, rather than serial killers running slavery operations disguised as brothels. The sheer duration of their operation, nearly 20 years from the mid-1940s to 1964, is staggering. How did they avoid detection for so long? Several factors contributed to their success at evading law enforcement. First, their victims were specifically chosen because they wouldn't be missed. Poor rural women who disappeared were assumed to have simply moved away or met with any of the countless misfortunes that could befall vulnerable people in mid-20th century Mexico. Their families, if they had families, lacked the resources and knowledge to conduct investigations or push authorities to care about missing women. Second, societal attitudes toward prostitution meant that even when women did escape or try to report abuse, they were dismissed as criminals themselves rather than victims. Police and authorities were often corrupt, receiving bribes from brothel owners to ignore complaints and violations. Third, the sisters were careful about which clients they murdered, targeting only those who appeared to be traveling through the area rather than locals with families who would report them missing immediately. The sisters' downfall came in January 1964, triggered by an event that seemed minor at the time but unraveled their entire operation. A woman in Leon, Guanajuato reported her sister missing to police. The missing woman, Catalina Salazar, had told family she was going to work at a house owned by some women named Gonzalez. The police, likely accustomed to dismissing such reports about women who'd run away or entered sex work, initially weren't particularly interested. But the complainant was persistent, and eventually the police agreed to investigate. They went to one of the Gonzalez sisters' properties in Leon and knocked on the door. When the door opened, they immediately sensed something wrong: the smell of decay, the sound of women crying from somewhere inside the building, the nervous behavior of the person who answered. The police forced their way inside, and what they found was beyond anything they'd imagined possible. Inside that brothel, police discovered multiple women locked in rooms, severely malnourished, covered in injuries, clearly being held against their will. Some were hysterical, others were catatonic from trauma. All begged the police to help them and to arrest the women who owned the property. As police searched the building, they found evidence of violence everywhere: bloodstains, chains and restraints, instruments of torture. And then, in the basement in the courtyard, they began finding bodies, not fresh corpses, but skeletal remains, badly decomposed bodies, signs of numerous burials. The police called for backup and forensic investigators. They expanded their search to other properties owned by the sisters, and everywhere they looked they found the same thing: enslaved women, evidence of violence, and buried bodies. The initial missing person report had uncovered one of the worst serial murder cases in Mexican history. The exhumation of bodies took weeks. Forensic teams carefully excavated the properties, documenting each grave and attempting to identify remains. The process was complicated because many bodies had been buried for years and were severely decomposed. Some were buried in lime, which accelerated decomposition. Multiple bodies were often buried in a single grave, making separation and counting difficult. The official death toll eventually reached 91 confirmed victims, though investigators believed the actual number was likely much higher. Some bodies were identified through dental records, personal effects buried with them, or recognition by surviving family members who'd been searching for missing relatives for years. Many remained unidentified, anonymous victims whose names and stories died with them. The 91 confirmed deaths included women who'd been enslaved in the brothels, babies born and killed there, and male clients who'd been murdered and robbed. The sisters were arrested at different times over several days as police tracked them down. Delfina and Maria de Jesus were caught first, arrested at one of their properties while trying to destroy evidence. Maria Luisa was found at another location. Carmen, the youngest, tried to flee but was apprehended within a week. All four denied everything initially, claiming they ran legitimate businesses and had no knowledge of any murders. But the evidence was overwhelming: dozens of bodies buried on their properties, survivor testimony from women they'd enslaved, and confessions from their male employees who agreed to testify in exchange for reduced sentences. As the investigation continued, the sisters began turning on each other, each trying to minimize her own involvement by blaming the others, particularly Delfina for the violence and murders. The trial of Las Poquianchis became a media sensation in Mexico. The courtroom was packed every day with journalists, curious onlookers, and family members of victims seeking justice and closure. The evidence presented was so disturbing that some jury members and spectators became physically ill, hearing testimony about torture, infanticide, and mass murder. Survivors testified about the horrors they'd endured, describing in graphic detail how the sisters had operated their empire of exploitation. Forensic experts presented evidence about causes of death and burial practices. Employees testified about orders they'd received and crimes they'd witnessed or participated in. The sisters' defense attorneys argued that the women had been raised in abusive circumstances and shouldn't be held fully responsible for their actions, an argument that failed to generate much sympathy given the scale and duration of their crimes. The trial revealed details that shocked even investigators accustomed to violent crime. The systematic nature of the murders, the casual way the sisters discussed killing women who'd become inconvenient, the torture methods employed purely for entertainment rather than control. These details painted a picture of profound evil. Delfina in particular emerged as someone who genuinely enjoyed inflicting pain, who had used her position to satisfy sadistic impulses on a massive scale over 2 decades. Maria de Jesus was portrayed as equally culpable, but perhaps less personally violent, more focused on the business aspects of their operation. Maria Luisa had recruited many of the victims, using her friendly demeanor to lure women into the trap. Carmen, being youngest, received slightly more sympathetic treatment from some quarters, though evidence showed she'd been complicit in the operation and had participated in violence against the enslaved women. The verdict was guilty on all counts for all four sisters. Under Mexican law at the time, the death penalty had been abolished, so the maximum sentence was 40 years imprisonment. Delfina and Maria de Jesus received 40-year sentences. Maria Luisa received 37 years. Carmen received 30 years. The sentences were controversial. Many people felt that 40 years for 91 murders was grossly inadequate, that the sisters deserved death for their crimes. But Mexican law didn't allow for longer sentences or capital punishment, so the courts handed down the maximum penalties available. The sisters were sent to different prisons to serve their sentences, with authorities concerned that keeping them together might allow them to continue exerting control over others or conspiring to continue criminal activities even from prison. The aftermath of the case rippled through Mexican society in profound ways. The revelation that women could commit such systematic violence challenged cultural assumptions about gender and criminality. Mexico, like most societies, held deeply ingrained beliefs that women were naturally more nurturing and less violent than men, that female criminals were rare anomalies rather than common occurrences. Las Poquianchis forced a reckoning with these assumptions. The sisters weren't acting under male control or coercion. They'd built and run their criminal empire themselves, made their own decisions about who to kill and how, and profited enormously from 2 decades of exploitation and murder. Their crimes proved conclusively that women were capable of the same calculated evil as male serial killers, that gender wasn't a predictor of capacity for violence, and that society's assumptions about women and criminality were dangerously naive. The case also exposed the vulnerability of poor women in mid-20th century Mexico and the complete failure of social systems to protect them. The sisters had operated openly for 20 years, running multiple locations, traveling frequently between them, interacting with community members and authorities, yet nobody stopped them. Nobody investigated missing women reports seriously. Nobody questioned how these businesswomen were generating their income. Nobody cared enough about poor rural women to notice when dozens of them disappeared after going to work for the Gonzalez sisters. This indifference enabled the sisters to operate with impunity for 2 decades. The case forced Mexican society to confront uncomfortable truths about how certain populations, poor women, sex workers, rural people, were viewed as disposable, how their disappearances were dismissed rather than investigated, and how this societal indifference created opportunities for predators to operate freely. The fate of the survivors was mixed and often tragic. The women rescued from the brothels when the operation was finally raided faced enormous challenges. Many had been held for years and had no families to return to or no way to locate their families. They had no money, no identification, no job skills beyond what they'd been forced to do in the brothels. They'd been severely traumatized, physically and psychologically damaged by years of abuse. Mexican society in the 1960s had limited social services and virtually no support systems for trafficking survivors or former sex workers. Many of the rescued women struggled to rebuild their lives, facing stigma and discrimination because of how they'd been forced to survive. Some managed to reconnect with families and find legitimate employment. Others disappeared back into the margins of society, their futures after rescue as tragic as their years of enslavement had been. The cultural impact of Los Poquianchis extended far beyond the immediate aftermath of the trial. The case entered Mexican folklore and popular culture, becoming shorthand for female evil and betrayal. The term Poquianchis itself became an insult in some regions, used to describe women viewed as manipulative or cruel. Multiple books were written about the case, each attempting to explain how four sisters became such prolific killers. Films and documentaries were produced, though these often sensationalized the crimes, rather than seriously examining the social conditions that enabled them. The sisters became boogeymen in Mexican culture, cautionary tales told to warn young women about the dangers of accepting employment from strangers, though these warnings often missed the deeper point about systemic failures that made women so vulnerable in the first place. Delfina Gonzalez died in prison in 1968, just 4 years into her 40-year sentence. Official reports stated she died of natural causes, though some accounts suggest she was killed by other prisoners who viewed her crimes as particularly heinous even by prison standards. Maria de Jesus died in prison in 1990 after serving 26 years of her sentence. Maria Luisa died in 1984 after 20 years in prison. Carmen, the youngest, reportedly survived the longest but died in prison in the early 1990s, though exact records are inconsistent. None of the sisters ever expressed genuine remorse for their crimes. In interviews conducted during their imprisonment, they consistently minimized their involvement, blamed each other, and showed more concern for their own circumstances than for the dozens of people they'd murdered. To the end, Los Poquianchis remained cold and calculating, unable or unwilling to acknowledge the human cost of their 2 decades of exploitation and violence. The investigation into the full scope of the sisters' crimes was never complete. The 91 confirmed victims represent only the bodies that were found and could be documented with certainty. Investigators believe the actual death toll was higher, possibly much higher. The sisters operated multiple locations over nearly 20 years, and not all properties were thoroughly searched. Some locations may have been sold or demolished before the investigation began, their buried secrets lost forever. Additionally, the sisters were vague and contradictory when questioned about the number of people they'd killed, sometimes claiming fewer victims, sometimes admitting to more, never providing consistent or reliable information. The true number of women murdered, babies killed or sold, and clients robbed and murdered will never be known with certainty. 91 is the confirmed minimum, but the actual total could easily be double that or more. The case raises disturbing questions about family dynamics and shared criminality. How do siblings, particularly sisters, who society often imagines as being close and supportive, collaborate on mass murder for 20 years? What conversations happened between them as they decided who to kill next? Did they ever disagree about violence? Or were they unified in their willingness to murder? Did any of them feel guilt or hesitation? Or were they all equally cold-blooded? The evidence suggests that while Delfina was the primary sadist and decision-maker, all four sisters were active participants who understood exactly what they were doing and chose to continue doing it year after year. This wasn't a case of one dominant personality controlling the others through fear or manipulation. This was genuine collaboration, division of labor, and shared profit from systematic murder. The family bond between the sisters somehow coexisted with their willingness to inflict unimaginable suffering on other women, and that paradox remains difficult to fully comprehend. I think about the victims often when I research this case, not just the confirmed 91, but all the unknown women whose bodies were never found or identified, the babies who died unnamed and unmourned, the families who spent years searching for missing daughters and sisters without ever learning what happened to them. Each woman who was recruited by the Gonzalez sisters believed she was getting a legitimate opportunity to improve her life and help her family. Each one trusted the sisters' promises of employment and a better future, and that trust was betrayed in the most horrible way imaginable, not just being forced into prostitution, but being systematically abused, dehumanized, and ultimately murdered when she was no longer profitable. The psychological terror of knowing that escape was impossible, that help would never come, that death was the likely outcome. I cannot imagine living in that reality, and I'm haunted by the knowledge that dozens of women did live it, some for years before finally being killed. The child victims particularly devastate me. Babies born in those brothels never had any chance at life. They were killed as infants, or sold like property to people who wanted children without going through legitimate adoption processes. These babies had no names, no birth certificates, no official existence. They were born into hell and died there, or were sold and raised by people who had obtained them through criminal networks. The mothers of these babies, women who had been raped repeatedly by clients and became pregnant as a result of that rape, had to endure pregnancy in horrific conditions, give birth without medical care, and then either watch their babies be killed or have them taken away to be sold. The layers of trauma inflicted on these women are almost incomprehensible. They were enslaved, raped, forcibly impregnated, denied medical care during pregnancy, forced to give birth in filthy conditions, and then had their babies murdered or stolen. And after enduring all that, they'd be returned to servicing clients until they were eventually killed themselves. The societal failures that enabled Los Poquianchis to operate for 20 years deserve serious examination. This wasn't a case where the sisters were brilliant criminals who covered their tracks perfectly. They operated openly, owned multiple properties, traveled frequently, employed numerous people who witnessed their crimes, and left a trail of missing women behind them. Yet nobody stopped them. Police dismissed reports of missing women. Authorities accepted bribes to ignore violations. Society assumed that women in prostitution had chosen that life and deserved whatever happened to them. The combination of corruption, indifference, and classism created an environment where serial killers could operate with near-complete impunity as long as they targeted the right victims, poor women whom nobody valued enough to protect. Las Poquiancas didn't succeed because they were clever. They succeeded because Mexican society in the mid-20th century simply didn't care what happened to poor women. The case also challenges simplistic narratives about how people become killers. The Gonzalez sisters came from an abusive background, certainly, and that trauma likely shaped their worldview and capacity for violence. But plenty of people experience childhood abuse without becoming serial killers. The sisters made choices, repeatedly and over 2 decades, to exploit and murder other people for profit. They weren't forced into this lifestyle. They built it deliberately, expanded it systematically, and participated enthusiastically in violence. At some point, regardless of their traumatic past, they became fully responsible for their actions and the suffering they inflicted. Understanding their background helps explain how they became capable of such evil, but it doesn't excuse or justify 91 murders and decades of torture and exploitation. Modern human trafficking operations show disturbing similarities to the methods Los Poquiancas employed. Vulnerable people, usually women and girls, are recruited with false promises of legitimate employment. They're transported away from their support networks to unfamiliar locations. Their identification documents are confiscated. They're forced into sexual exploitation through debt, bondage, violence, and psychological control. They're kept isolated and given no opportunity to escape. If they become inconvenient through pregnancy, illness, aging, or simply knowing too much they're disposed of. The specific details may vary, but the fundamental structure of exploitation that the Gonzalez sisters pioneered in the 1940s-60s remains the blueprint for human trafficking networks today. Las Poquianchis weren't unique historical anomalies. They were early practitioners of methods that criminal organizations still use in the 21st century, and their success at operating undetected for 20 years provides lessons that modern traffickers have clearly learned. The question of whether LA's Poquianchis could operate today in the same way is complicated. On one hand, modern communication technology, DNA databases, missing persons networks, and more sophisticated law enforcement might make it harder to disappear multiple people without detection. On the other hand, vulnerable populations still exist. Societal indifference to certain victims remains deeply entrenched, and human trafficking continues on a massive scale globally. The fundamental conditions that enabled the sisters to operate: poverty, isolation, corruption, and society's willingness to ignore the suffering of marginalized people haven't been eliminated. They've just evolved into different forms. So while an exact replica of the sisters' operation might be more difficult today, the essential evil they represented, systematic exploitation and murder of vulnerable people for profit, continues in various forms around the world. I visited Guanajuato several years ago while researching this case. The properties where the murders occurred have long since been demolished or converted to other uses. Nothing remains to mark where dozens of women were enslaved, tortured, and buried. Local people know the history, but often prefer not to discuss it, treating Las Poquianchis as a shameful chapter best left in the past. Standing on streets where the brothels once operated, looking at buildings that might occupy the same ground where bodies were buried, I tried to feel some connection to the victims, to honor their memory in some small way. But mostly I felt anger that these women suffered so much, anger that society abandoned them so completely, anger that the sisters who murdered them got to live in prison for years while their victims died young and afraid, and anger that we still haven't fixed the systems that enabled these crimes and continue to enable similar exploitation today. The legacy of Las Poquianchis is uncomfortable for Mexico and for society more broadly because it forces confrontation with truths we'd rather avoid. It proves that women can be as violent and cruel as men. It demonstrates that family bonds can coexist with shared criminality. It exposes how vulnerable populations are systematically abandoned by society and law enforcement. It reveals that serial murder can be conducted as a business model over decades without detection if the right victims are chosen. And it reminds us that evil isn't always recognizable, that the most dangerous predators often hide behind facades of respectability and normalcy. The Gonzalez sisters looked like successful businesswomen. They attended church. They participated in community life. And behind closed doors, they tortured and murdered at least 91 people over 20 years. That's the reality. Las Poquianchis represent not exceptional monsters, but ordinary people who chose to do monstrous things and got away with it for most of their adult lives. So how did three sisters, four, counting Carmen, though her involvement was less extensive, murder 91 people? The answer is depressingly simple. They identified vulnerable victims whom society didn't value. They exploited every structural inequality and social failure that made those victims easy targets. They used violence and isolation to maintain control, and they operated in an environment where corruption and indifference enabled them to continue for 20 years without serious investigation. They succeeded not because they were brilliant criminals, but because they understood that certain people could be disappeared without consequences, and they built a business model around that understanding. Las Poquianchis weren't unique. They were just unusually prolific at doing what countless other predators do, targeting the vulnerable, exploiting the abandoned, and profiting from society's failures to protect its most marginalized members. The story of Las Poquianchis isn't just history. It's a warning about what happens when society devalues certain lives, when corruption replaces justice, when we allow ourselves to dismiss suffering because it affects people we consider disposable. The Gonzalez sisters murdered 91 confirmed victims and probably many more, but they didn't do it alone. They were enabled by every person who dismissed missing women reports, every official who accepted bribes to look the other way, every citizen who assumed prostitutes deserved whatever happened to them, and every system that treated poor rural women as less valuable than other lives. The sisters pulled the triggers and swung the weapons. But society loaded the gun by creating conditions where such crimes were possible and sustainable for 20 years. I look at photographs from the trial, grainy black and white images of the sisters sitting in court, their faces showing defiance rather than remorse. Delfina looks cold and calculating, even in custody, her eyes hard and empty of empathy. Maria de Jesus appears, resigned but unrepentant. The younger sisters seem almost confused that they're being held accountable, as if they genuinely believed they could continue operating indefinitely without consequences. None of them look like the monsters they were. They look like ordinary middle-aged women, the kind you might see in any market or church in Mexico. That ordinariness is part of what makes them so disturbing. Evil doesn't announce itself with dramatic music and ominous lighting. It looks like your neighbor, your employer, the woman offering you a job when you're desperate. Las Poquianchis proved that monsters wear human faces and that the most dangerous predators are often the ones who seem most normal. The Gonzalez sisters destroyed hundreds of lives, not just the 91 confirmed murder victims, but their families who never got answers. The survivors who carried trauma for the rest of their lives, the children who were sold into unknown fates, and the communities that were traumatized by the revelation of such horror in their midst. The ripples of their crimes extended far beyond the immediate victims, creating waves of suffering that touched countless people and lasted for generations. Some families are still searching for relatives who disappeared in the 1950s and early 60s, still hoping for information about what happened, still carrying the burden of not knowing whether their missing daughter or sister was one of LA's Poquianchis victims. The sisters took not just lives but also closure, leaving behind questions that will never be fully answered and grief that will never fully heal. The case also stands as a grim milestone in the history of female criminality. Before Las Poquianchis, female serial killers were rare and usually operated alone or with male partners who were assumed to be the dominant force. The Gonzalez sisters proved that women could form criminal partnerships with other women, could operate large-scale criminal enterprises without male control, and could commit violence that rivaled or exceeded anything male killers had done. They expanded our understanding of what women were capable of, both in terms of criminality and cruelty. This wasn't a comfortable or welcome expansion of understanding, but it was necessary. The assumption that women were naturally less violent or more nurturing than men had real consequences. It made law enforcement less likely to investigate female suspects, made society less likely to believe victims who reported abuse by women, and created blind spots that predators like the Gonzalez sisters exploited. Modern criminologists and psychologists continue studying Las Poquianchis, trying to understand the psychology that enabled four sisters to collaborate on such sustained violence. Were they all psychopaths lacking empathy, or did they develop callousness over time through repeated exposure to suffering? Did they genuinely believe their victims deserved what happened to them, or did they simply not care? How did their shared history of abuse shape their capacity for inflicting abuse on others? Were there moments of doubt or guilt that they suppressed, or did they sleep soundly after days spent torturing and murdering? These questions remain partially unanswered because the sisters themselves were unreliable narrators of their own psychology, more interested in minimizing their guilt than honestly examining their motivations. What we know is that they killed systematically for 20 years, that they showed no mercy to their victims, and that even in prison they expressed more self-pity than remorse. The economic aspect of their crimes deserves emphasis. Las Poquianchis operated their murder enterprise as a business, making calculated decisions about costs, revenues, and profit maximization. Women who became pregnant represented lost revenue, so they were killed. Women who got sick became liabilities, so they were disposed of. Clients who appeared wealthy were robbed and murdered because their assets were worth more than future business they might bring. The sisters treated human beings as inventory to be managed and discarded based on financial calculations. This mercenary approach to murder killing, not from passion or compulsion but from cold business logic, is perhaps more disturbing than violence driven by psychological dysfunction. It suggests that the sisters had normal cognitive function and chose murder deliberately as the most profitable option available to them, fully understanding the moral weight of what they were doing and simply not caring. The failure of Mexican authorities to detect the operation for 20 years also reflects broader patterns of corruption and incompetence that plagued law enforcement during this period. The sisters paid bribes to local officials who warned them about investigations and looked the other way regarding their activities. Police dismiss reports from women who escaped or from families searching for missing relatives. The assumption that prostitution was inherently criminal meant that violence against sex workers was rarely investigated seriously. This institutional failure wasn't unique to the Gonzalez sisters. It reflected systemic problems in Mexican law enforcement that enabled numerous criminal operations to function openly. The eventual discovery of Los Poquianchis crimes led to some reforms, but corruption and indifference toward certain victims remain ongoing problems in Mexico and globally. I think about what it must have been like to be a woman in one of those brothels, knowing that escape was impossible and death was probable. The psychological torture of that situation, the complete loss of hope, the daily fear, the witnessing of other women being beaten and killed, the knowledge that you would likely meet the same fate is almost incomprehensible. Some survivors describe developing a kind of psychological numbness, dissociating from their bodies and circumstances as a coping mechanism to survive the unendurable. Others describe constant terror that made sleep impossible and left them in a state of perpetual hypervigilance. The long-term psychological damage inflicted on survivors was profound and permanent. Even decades after their rescue, survivors struggled with PTSD, depression, trust issues, and the inability to form normal relationships. The sisters didn't just kill their victims, they destroyed the humanity of the survivors who lived through their imprisonment. The babies who were sold rather than killed faced uncertain fates that are impossible to fully trace. Some may have been adopted by people who genuinely wanted children and provided good homes, never knowing their child's horrific origin. Others were likely sold to people involved in various criminal enterprises, child labor, sexual exploitation, or organs harvesting. The adoption black market in Mexico during this period was largely unregulated and often connected to organized crime. Children sold through such networks had no legal identity, no birth certificates, no official existence. They could be abused, exploited, or killed with no record that they'd ever existed. The Gonzalez sisters profited from selling babies and never faced additional charges for child trafficking, because prosecutors focused on the murder charges and because tracking the sold children was nearly impossible. Given the lack of documentation, an unknown number of people alive today in Mexico and possibly beyond are the children who were born in Los Poquianchis brothels and sold as infants, living entire lives without knowing their origin or the horror surrounding their birth. The trial testimony from survivors was both heartbreaking and crucial to convicting the sisters. These women had to recount in public court the most traumatic experiences of their lives, reliving their abuse and humiliation while the sisters who'd inflicted it sat meters away. The courage required to testify cannot be overstated. Many survivors were terrified of retaliation from the sisters' associates or of being judged by society for their forced participation in prostitution. But they testified anyway, driven by the need for justice and a determination to ensure the sisters couldn't hurt anyone else. Their testimony was graphic and disturbing, detailing specific incidents of torture, rape, and murder. Several survivors broke down crying on the stand. Others delivered their testimony in flat, emotionless voices, dissociation being the only way they could speak about what had happened. Every word they spoke was paid for with psychological pain, and their willingness to endure that pain to achieve justice deserves recognition and respect. The question of how to remember Los Poquianchis and their victims remains contested. Some argue that the sisters should be forgotten, that giving them attention glorifies their crimes and provides the notoriety they don't deserve. Others contend that remembering is necessary both to honor victims and to learn from the societal failures that enabled the crimes. I fall in the latter category. Forgetting Los Poquianchis means forgetting their victims, forgetting the systemic problems that enabled 20 years of murder, and missing opportunities to prevent similar crimes in the future. The goal isn't to celebrate the sisters or make them famous. The goal is to remember what happened, to understand how it was possible, and to ensure that the women they murdered aren't reduced to statistics, but recognized as individuals who suffered and died. Each of those 91 confirmed victims had a name, a life, dreams and fears, and people who loved them. They deserve to be remembered as human beings, not just as numbers in a body count. The parallels between Los Poquianchis' operation and modern human trafficking are too significant to ignore. Today, an estimated 40 million people are trapped in various forms of forced labor and sexual exploitation globally. The methods used to control them: debt, bondage, violence, isolation, threats against family members, confiscation of identification documents are the same methods the Gonzalez sisters used 70 years ago. The vulnerability of victims is the same: poverty, lack of education, displacement, marginalization. The societal indifference is the same: law enforcement that doesn't prioritize these cases, corruption that protects traffickers, assumptions that victims somehow chose their situation or deserved it. Los Poquianchis weren't historical anomalies. They were pioneers of methods that criminal organizations continue using today at vastly larger scale. Understanding their operation provides insight into how modern trafficking works and why it remains so difficult to combat. The Sisters operation also highlights how women can be perpetrators as well as victims of gender-based violence. Feminism has rightly focused attention on violence against women. Alas, Poquianchis remind us that women are capable of inflicting such violence on other women. This doesn't diminish the reality of patriarchal violence or excuse the systemic oppression women face. It simply acknowledges the full complexity of human behavior and the reality that gender doesn't determine capacity for cruelty. The Gonzalez sisters exploited other women as ruthlessly as any male trafficker or abuser has done. They show no solidarity with their victims despite sharing gender. They used societal sexism to their advantage, playing on assumptions that women were less dangerous, less capable of violence, more trustworthy than men. This weaponization of gendered expectations enabled them to recruit victims who might have been more suspicious of male recruiters and to avoid scrutiny from authorities. Who couldn't imagine women running such a brutal operation? I wonder sometimes whether any of the sisters ever had moments of genuine reflection about what they'd done. Did Delfina, in the 4 years she spent in prison before dying, ever truly confront the horror she'd inflicted? Did Maria of De Jesus, who survived in prison until 1990, ever feel authentic remorse for the decades of exploitation and murder? Or did they remain psychologically defended until death, telling themselves justifications and minimizations, blaming circumstances and other people, never accepting responsibility for their choices? Prison interviews suggest the latter of the sisters consistently portrayed themselves as victims of circumstances, of abuse, of their own troubled past, never acknowledging that at some point personal history stops being an explanation and becomes the excuse. They had agency. They made choices. They chose to hurt and kill people for profit, repeatedly, for 20 years. Whatever their background, however they justified it to themselves, that responsibility remained theirs to bear. The cultural memory of Las Poquiancas in Mexico is complicated by sensationalism and misogyny. Media coverage often focuses on the evil woman angle with a salacious emphasis on the brothel setting, treating the case more as lurid entertainment than serious examination of serial murder and human trafficking. This sensationalism obscures the real lessons of the case and disrespects the victims by turning their suffering into tabloid fodder. Additionally, the case has been weaponized by misogynists who use it to argue that women are just as evil as men, deliberately missing the point that the case demonstrates capacity for violence exists across genders without erasing the reality of systemic violence against women. Las Paquiancas deserve serious study and remembrance, but that requires moving beyond sensationalism and bad faith argumentation to honestly examine what the case reveals about human evil, societal failures, and the ongoing crisis of violence against vulnerable populations. The Gonzalez sisters spent their final years in prison, separated from each other, aging and dying in custody, without ever experiencing anything close to the suffering they'd inflicted on their victims. This seems inadequate as justice, and it is, but it was the maximum punishment available under Mexican law at the time. The debate about whether they deserved death, whether 40 years was sufficient for 91 murders, whether any punishment could truly balance the scales of justice, these debates missed the fundamental reality that no punishment could undo what had been done, could restore the lives taken, could heal the trauma inflicted. Justice in cases like this is always incomplete because the harm is irreversible. The best we can hope for is accountability, prevention of future crimes, and support for survivors. The sisters were held accountable through conviction and imprisonment. Future crimes were prevented through their incarceration and the public exposure of trafficking methods. But support for survivors remained grossly inadequate then and remains insufficient now for victims of similar crimes. So how did three sisters murder 91 people? They did it by identifying society's blind spots and exploiting them ruthlessly. They did it by targeting victims whom the system had already abandoned. They did it by operating in an environment where corruption trumped justice and where certain lives were deemed disposable. They did it by treating murder as business and human beings as inventory. They did it over 20 years because nobody with power cared enough to stop them until a single persistent family member refused to accept official indifference to a missing woman, and they almost got away with it entirely. Would have continued for who knows how many more years and how many more victims if not for chance, persistence, and the eventual discovery that forced law enforcement to confront what they'd been ignoring for 2 decades. Los Poquianchis succeeded not because they were brilliant criminals, but because they understood that society creates spaces where predators can operate freely. And they built their empire in those shadows where nobody was watching and nobody cared.